On February 8, 1985, newlyweds John and Linda Sohus walked out of their home on Lorraine Road in San Marino, California, and into a mystery that has baffled investigators for decades. Before their disappearance, Linda had confided to her best friend, Sue Kaufman, that they had been offered a government job that they weren't allowed to talk about, and that it required them to take a 2-week trip to New York. But then, the next thing anyone knew, 8 weeks had passed since the couple had left. This was when Katherine Jacoby, Linda's younger sister, received a call from a local kennel who notified her that Linda had paid in advance to board her 6 cats for a 2-week stay. But now it had been 2 months, and the kennel hadn't received any update from Linda on when she would be picking up her pets. The moment Katherine heard this, her stomach tightened into a knot. She knew her sister too well. Linda would never abandon her pets, not without a plan. If she truly expected to be away for long, she would have taken the cats with her. The unease that followed told her she couldn't wait. She needed answers. Her first call was to John's mother, Dee Dee. John and Linda had been living with her in San Marino, and if anyone had an inkling where they'd gone, it would be her. And sure enough, according to Dee Dee, she did know where they had gone, but what she told Katherine was anything but reassuring. In one of several frustrating phone calls, Dee Dee claimed she couldn't say where the couple was. They were, as she insisted, away on a secret government mission. Dee Dee had long struggled with alcoholism, and Katherine suspected she'd been drinking during these conversations. The details shifted depending on the time of day, the stories veering from implausible to outright absurd. But Dee Dee always maintained the core narrative, that John and Linda were on a secret mission for the government. Linda's family, not prepared to trust that Dee Dee's story was anything other than a drunken delusion, filed a missing persons report with the police. Linda had met John in the aisles of Dangerous Visions, a science fiction bookstore where she worked and where John's visits soon became more than casual browsing. They bonded over a shared love of distant worlds and imagined futures. For them, romance didn't mean candlelit dinners and fancy restaurants. It meant rolling dice over a Dungeons & Dragons map, or weaving through the crowd at a sci-fi or fantasy convention. John was described as a delightfully quirky, gentle soul. His half-sister Ellen recalled him as the original nerd, gentle, fun-loving, curious. He knew everything. As for Linda, friends and family described her as strong, outgoing, and self-assured. To their friends, they weren't just compatible, they were inseparable. 2 people who seemed to fit so perfectly, like 2 peas in a pod. It was hard to picture one without the other. The 2 inevitably got married on Halloween night in 1983. They were described by close friends as 2 contented puppies. Career-wise, both were still at the starting line, with the road ahead wide open for opportunities. John worked part-time as a computer programmer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Linda remained a clerk at Dangerous Visions, the sci-fi bookstore where they'd first met, while chasing her artistic ambitions. She had just begun carving out a small place for herself in the art world, where she had become well known within the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society for creating the cover art of its publications. Linda had recently sold a small illustration to the New Yorker magazine for $700 and hosted her own gallery show. John and Linda Sohus were still finding their footing, still learning how to navigate adulthood together. But to anyone who knew them, the future looked bright. The newlyweds moved in with John's adoptive mother, Ruth Dee Dee Sohus, at her affluent home in San Marino. However, this decision was mostly driven by finances rather than sentimentality. Their original plan was to settle into the guest house, but a tenant was already renting the space. With the space occupied, John and Linda stayed in the main house with Dee Dee, promising themselves it would only be temporary, just until they could afford a place of their own. It was during this period of their lives that Linda eventually confided in a friend about the couple's new high-level, high-security government job offer in New York City. The work, she explained, would take them away for 2 weeks. It was strange, but then again, nothing about the eccentric young couple was exactly normal to begin with, and so no one thought much of it. That was until 2 months had passed without any word from John or Linda, and their friends and family began to panic. The only person who seemed unfazed, strangely enough, was John's mother, Dee Dee. But you shouldn't feel unfazed when it comes to your own security. If you look up your name online, you'll probably find your personal details, like your home address, email address, and number. It's a scary thing when you realize anyone can get that info. That's where this video's sponsor, Aura, can help. In today's world, data is a valuable asset, and data brokers trade your info with those pesky robocallers and spammers, making billions, doing it without your consent. They're legally required to remove your information if you ask them to, but make you jump through hoops, which is how Aura can help. Aura identifies where your information is being exposed and submit opt-out requests on your behalf so that you don't have to do all the legwork. Get an alert immediately when there's suspicious activity on any of your financial assets, online accounts, or personal data. Aura combines internet security app features including VPN, password management, antivirus, identity theft insurance, and more, all in one service, so you don't have to pay for several different apps. Get a 2-week free trial of Aura with our link in the description at aura.com/brew. It's easy to set up, and once you do, it'll keep you and your family safe online. When Linda's family filed the missing persons report and the investigation began, Dee Dee quickly stood out, not for what she revealed, but for what she held back. On April 8, 1985, San Marino police officer Thomas Levesque went to her residence to conduct an interview, but according to Dee Dee, there was no need to be worried for her son and daughter-in-law's safety. She repeated the same thing she had told Linda's sister Katherine, insisting that John and Linda were away on a top-secret government mission and that no one had heard from them because of the mission's sensitive nature. Well, no one other than her at least. Dee Dee claimed to have an unnamed government source who acted as a liaison, passing on updates from the couple and delivering her messages. Investigators, however, couldn't verify that such a source existed at the time, as Dee Dee adamantly refused to name who this person was. 8 days later, on April 16th, Officer George Yankovic walked up the Sohus driveway on Lorraine Road and knocked on the door of the guest house. The man who answered was completely naked, standing in the doorway without a hint of concern. When asked to put on clothes, he casually refused, explaining that he was a nudist. He introduced himself, and when questioned about John and Linda's disappearance, he repeated the same story as his landlord Dee Dee, that the newlywed couple was off on a secret government mission. Back at the station, Officer Yankovic ran the nudist tenant's information through the California law enforcement telecommunications system. The results confirmed that a driver's license did exist under the name he had given, but something odd stood out in the records. The database carried another alias associated with that driver's license. Why did the strange man living in Dee Dee's guest house seemingly have 2 completely different identities on file? And why had he said the exact same thing as Dee Dee when questioned regarding John and Linda's whereabouts? Could he secretly be the government contact Dee Dee claimed was the middleman in her communications with the couple? A month later, in May 1985, Linda's mother, Susan Mayfield, received an ominous postcard. The note was brief, almost flippant. "I think we need a geography lesson, but not too bad. Linda and John." But the message wasn't what unsettled Susan most. It was the stamp. The postcard had been postmarked not from New York, but from France. This clashed with everything Linda had said before leaving. She told friends they were headed to New York, not Europe, and Susan knew something else. Linda didn't even have a passport, nor the money to afford a trip overseas. The postcard, instead of reassuring her that her daughter was okay, only raised more questions. Another cryptic postcard from France was received by Linda's best friend, Sue Kaufman. "Dear Sue, kind of miss New York. Oops, but this can be lived with. John and Linda." Sue told investigators that the postcard didn't read like Linda at all. The phrasing felt off. That suspicion was only reinforced by Linda's mother, who also doubted the authenticity of the cards. On April 28, 1985, almost 3 months after Linda and John went missing, Dee Dee had a change of heart. She finally filed a missing persons report herself. In addition, she started being more cooperative with authorities and even identified her trusted source, the nudist who lived in her guest house. But why had she chosen to reveal her source now? Well, apparently it was because the man had suddenly vanished, along with John's 1985 Nissan pickup truck. She couldn't say for certain when exactly, or if they were connected, only that they had both disappeared. For investigators, it felt like progress had finally been made, only for all of it to collapse in the same breath. The strange tenant had slipped away without a trace, and with no evidence of foul play, the case stood at a frustrating impasse. The case started getting cold at this point. Not long after filing the missing persons report, Dee Dee sold her home and moved into a trailer park. For someone who had once been a socialite in the 1930s and 40s, the decision seemed unusual. On February 2nd, 1988, 3 years later, she passed away, still carrying the pain of not knowing what had happened to her son. By this point, the investigation had stalled. 3 years had passed without a single breakthrough, and it seemed John and Linda were destined to become just one of a long list of unresolved missing persons cases. But 9 months after Dee Dee's death, the case finally stirred back to life once again. By 1988, Officer George Yankovic, among the first to investigate the Sohus case, had been promoted to detective. He chose to revisit the file and ran a search on John's missing truck. To his surprise, the check returned a hit. The search traced John's truck to the Bishop family in Greenwich, Connecticut. Detective Yankovic contacted the local police and asked Detective Daniel Allen to look into it. In early November 1988, Detective Allen drove to the Bishop home and spoke with Chris Bishop. When Allen explained that the truck was connected to a missing persons case, Bishop said that before it landed in his possession, it had belonged to a friend of his. Further inquiry into this friend revealed that he and the nudist tenant were one and the same. Bishop stated to Detective Allen how his friend had handed him the truck without asking for a cent. But when Bishop went to the DMV for the title, he uncovered a problem. A lien still clung to the vehicle. In simple terms, the bank still had a claim on it. It was tethered to a loan. That discovery pulled the shine off the gift and raised a disconcerting question. If his friend was handing out a vehicle that wasn't his to give, where did he get it? And where was the rightful owner? He claimed that his friend wouldn't take it back, leaving him with little choice. In the end, he abandoned the truck at a railroad station. After his talk with the detective, Bishop later called to confront his friend directly. He angrily told him that a detective had just visited his home and told him the man he thought he knew was wanted in connection with a missing persons case. Then came the question that cut through the lies. Who are you really? The response was brief. I gotta go, the nudist tenant said before hanging up. Bishop never heard from him again. As for Detective Allen, he checked the address that Bishop gave him, but the trail went cold as the suspect had already fled. In a cruel turn of events, the case once again faced a dead end. 6 years passed, and the disappearance of John and Linda Sohus still weighed heavily on those who knew them. The case had long since gone cold, but then came a grim discovery that shook the residents of San Marino to their very core. One that would reopen the search for answers and set the investigation on a new course. In early May 1994, a pool construction crew rolled into the backyard at 1920 Lorraine Road in San Marino. Heavy equipment operator Jose Perez was on the Bobcat when the bucket bit into something that wasn't dirt. Oddly, the crew found a large fiberglass container buried a few feet down. They dig the container out, not really thinking about it much other than just a slight setback to their day. They worked at the container slowly, prying it open until the hollow space inside came into view. Stuffed within were black trash bags, layered and heavy. Perez's father tugged one out and, uncertain of what he was dealing with, pressed a length of rebar against it. The bag shifted, and something pale rolled free. It was a human skull. The crew froze in place, the ordinary rhythm of a construction site swallowed by the horror of what they had uncovered. In an instant, the backyard dig turned into a crime scene. Work stopped, and the call to police was made. Officer Joe Lucero was first on the scene. What he found wasn't a single grave, but a scatter of bags with human remains near the shattered fiberglass container, all of which were in the blind spot behind the old guest house, not viewable from the main house. Anthropologist Judith Day cataloged the grim discovery. 2 plastic bags, one inside the other, containing the skull. The fiberglass drum with the lower half of the body still dressed in jeans, with socks and shoes carefully wrapped in plastic. Beside it, 2 more bags, each one holding a severed hand. From there, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department criminalist Lynn Harold made the connection that would tie the burial to the tenant who had disappeared years earlier. 2 of the bags had designs printed on them that could be used to trace their origins. One was a design only printed on University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee bookstore bags between 1979 and 1982. And another was used from the USC bookstore with a design used only between 1979 and 1984. Both were schools that the guest house tenant had claimed to attend during the years that those bag designs were in circulation. When the remains were uncovered, investigators quickly realized the challenge before them. Due to the level of decomposition, visual identification could not be completed. They could tell that the skeleton was male, but John Sohus had been adopted, and his biological family was unknown, which meant that a DNA test would lead nowhere. There were no dental records to fill the gap either. The scientists were left with only the bones themselves. And so, forensic experts meticulously measured the frame, examined the skull, and compared the physical structure against what was known of John. The build was right, the features aligned. Piece by piece, the profile came together until the experts could say that the skeleton had a good chance of being his. Yet without dental charts or DNA, there was no absolute certainty. The discovery of what they believed to be John Sohus's remains pushed investigators back to the San Marino property, searching for whatever else might have been missed. They turned to luminol, a chemical that reveals blood long after it's been wiped away, glowing faintly blue in the dark. When sprayed across the floorboards, the room answered back. The glow appeared, steady and undeniable, marks of blood that someone had tried to erase. Disturbingly, it wasn't just a trace of blood. Forensic investigators determined that a significant amount had once soaked the guest house. Forensic pathologist Dr. Frank Sheridan reviewed the body and determined John's death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head, paired with sharp force wounds consistent with a knife or box cutter. Even John's shirt bore cuts matching the attack. Nearly a decade after John and Linda vanished, investigators finally uncovered what they believed to be John Sohus's remains, buried in the backyard of his mother's home. Linda's fate, however, still remained unresolved. Plus, tracking down the man they believed to be responsible for John's death would be no simple task. At this point, police knew he hid behind a shifting series of false identities. Cornering him would take time, and perhaps one final mistake on his part. That mistake came 14 years later, in Boston, on July 27, 2008. A man was on a Sunday walk through the city with his 7-year-old daughter. Behind them was a social worker following closely behind. At the corner of Marlborough and Fairfield, the tranquil scene cracked. In a single motion, he shoved the social worker and pulled his daughter into a waiting SUV. "Go, go, go!" he barked at the driver. Tires screeched. The vehicle lurched forward, and with that, a national manhunt began. The FBI, Boston police, and federal marshals moved quickly. The kidnapper was supposedly a member of the Rockefeller family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in U.S. history. He was in the middle of a nasty divorce with his ex-wife, Sandra Boss, and an equally messy custody battle of their 7-year-old daughter. Ever since they had married in 1995, he insisted on secrecy in nearly every aspect of their life, refusing to let Sandra meet his family, forbidding photographs in their home, and tightly controlling the narrative of his past. To her colleagues at McKinsey & Company, he was reclusive and enigmatic, but Sandra accepted these quirks as part of his supposed aristocratic background. Eventually, the cracks became impossible to ignore. He never seemed to be working, lived off Sandra's multi-million-dollar income, even though he had originally claimed to be involved in secret government work. And once airlines started requiring identification from passengers, he refused to fly ever again. After years of tension and mounting distrust, in 2007, Sandra filed for divorce. She received sole custody of their daughter, while the supposed Rockefeller was granted only limited, supervised visitation. The settlement also required him to leave their home and sever ties with her finances, thus removing both the cover and the security that had sustained his illusion for the past 12 years. During the kidnapping, investigators further discovered a history of aliases which made him difficult to track. The SUV he had used to abduct his daughter during a supervised visit was abandoned within hours. From there, he slipped into the labyrinth of the East Coast with his daughter, moving by train, on foot, and in borrowed cars. For 6 days, the country watched. Tip lines rang with sightings, while authorities dug into his convoluted past, exposing more than 5 fabricated identities. Then, a tip from Baltimore came in. The kidnapper had purchased a modest home under yet another fake name and moored a catamaran nearby, perhaps hoping to vanish on the water. Investigators devised a simple trap. They called him and pretended to be someone warning him that his boat was taking on water. When he stepped outside the home to investigate, agents moved in. There was no chase, no dramatic struggle. He was arrested quietly. His daughter, found unharmed, was returned to her mother. With his arrest came the unmasking. Of course, he was no Rockefeller at all. His fingerprints told the truth. He was the nudist tenant, a parasite who had spent decades on the run, hiding behind fabricated identities and conning innocent people in order to survive. For years, his names had been little more than shadows in a cold case file. But now, more than 2 decades later, the picture was finally coming into focus. With the grifter finally in custody, prosecutors saw their chance to put an end to the Sohus case. The trial opened in Los Angeles in March 2013. The prosecution painted the accused as a man who spent his life constructing a tangled web of deceit and was willing to lie, steal, and even kill innocent people for personal gain. By this point, investigators had been able to locate a biological half-sister of John's and conduct a DNA test on the skeletal remains found buried behind Dee Dee's guest house, confirming that they indeed belonged to John. Now all that was left was to prove in court that the grifter was the one who killed him. The defense countered that the case was built on nothing but smoke. They emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence and suggested that John's own wife, Linda, could have killed him before vanishing. The defense mainly pointed to the postcards sent to family and friends from Paris to back up this narrative. They presented the testimony of 2 forensic document examiners who believed that the postcards were consistent with Linda's handwriting. In response, the prosecution pointed out multiple plot holes in this story. For one, there was nothing in U.S. Customs records of Linda applying for a passport or leaving the United States. Second, DNA testing on the postcards came back as negative for a match with Linda, John, or even the defendant. It was an unidentified male, so the idea that Linda was the one who sent these postcards from Paris was simply ridiculous. Most likely it was a third party in Paris that the defendant had hired to send the postcards as a ruse to keep people thinking that the couple was alive. Not only that, but the grifter had a history of using postcards sent from abroad to deceive people. For example, a past college girlfriend testified that he had told her he was going to be pursuing an internship with film director George Lucas in California. The next time she heard from him was through a postcard from Great Britain, telling her how he now lived in England. But in actuality, he had never worked with the creator of Star Wars, nor set foot out of the country. He had instead moved into Dee Dee's guest house in San Marino. Investigators had also searched a Baltimore storage unit tied to one of his many identities, and found preserved unused postcards from a variety of places. Further witness testimony during the trial helped fill in some of the gaps in the investigation and affirm the nudist tenant's guilt in the murder of John Sohus. One person who knew the tenant from church testified that shortly before John and Linda's disappearance, the tenant had borrowed a chainsaw from him and didn't return it until after the couple were gone. Another church acquaintance testified that around that same time, the tenant had asked him where he could dispose of drums of chemicals. The majority of John's remains were later found in a fiberglass drum. This same acquaintance also said that after the disappearance, the defendant had attempted to sell him a rug. But when his wife inspected it and found a bloodstain on it, they declined the offer. Apparently, the con man didn't even try to deny that the stain was blood. A neighbor of the Sohus family also testified that she had noticed a foul, awful smell and black smoke coming from the chimney of the guest house. When she called the tenant to complain about the odor, she asked what he was burning. He said he was burning carpet. She warned him that she was going to call the fire department. The burning stopped shortly afterward. Another neighbor attended a party that the tenant hosted at the guest house after John and Linda's disappearance. She noticed fresh dirt behind the guest house, a rectangular patch too neat to ignore. When she asked about it, he said he had been doing some plumbing work. This is the same area where John's remains were found 9 years later. There were no pipes or plumbing in this area of the property. All of these pieces of testimony put together with the facts that John's remains were found in plastic bags likely belonging to the tenant, that the floors of the guest house had at one point been covered in copious amounts of blood, and that he went on the run after the disappearance, all made it pretty obvious to the jury that he was the killer. As for a motive, the trial also revealed that after John and Linda's disappearance, Dee Dee came to believe that her son had abandoned her for his wife and proceeded to write John out of her will, thus denying him his inheritance of the home, which was worth a small fortune. Lead prosecutor Habib Balian of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office said, "With John and Linda Sohus out of the way, he would have been home alone with Dee Dee Sohus, a vulnerable old woman sitting on a large property in a wealthy San Marino neighborhood." Prosecutors theorized that the tenant's plan was to eventually convince Dee Dee to put his name on the will instead. But as neighbors and investigators began to ask questions, he got nervous and decided to go on the run. On April 10, 2013, after hearing 45 witnesses and examining 160 exhibits, a jury found the defendant guilty of the first-degree murder of John Sohus. He was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Even after judgment was passed, the trial left one giant unanswered question: what became of Linda Sohus? When it came to Linda, John's killer never said a word. In the courtroom, his silence was deafening. He chose not to testify. a decision that shielded him from cross-examination but left Linda's fate a void in the record. It was the opinion of some of the jury members that John's killer should receive a deal in exchange for Linda's whereabouts, but no deal was ever offered. The most straightforward explanation is that if the tenant murdered John, he killed Linda as well. When John's remains were found, authorities combed the surrounding areas but found nothing. Investigators believe she could have been killed within hours or days of her husband, and then her remains were destroyed, scattered, or hidden in a location that no one ever thought to search. But there is, of course, the possibility that Linda is still alive. Lydia Morano, Linda's employer at the bookstore and one of the recipients of the Paris postcards, testified that over the years following the couple's disappearance, she received a phone call from the May department stores company asking for a job reference for Linda Mayfield, which is Linda's maiden name, and then another call asking for a credit reference for Linda Sohus. If the claim is true, was this part of a ruse conducted by John's killer to make it seem as though Linda was still alive? Or was Linda out there somewhere, attempting to start a new life, and had put her past job at the bookstore on a resume? If Linda willingly disappeared and has been in hiding all these years, then one would assume she was complicit in her husband's death. But during the trial, every single witness who knew the couple, whether it be family, friends, neighbors, or employers, each insisted that 1. They never sensed any stress or conflict between John and Linda. 2. Linda had no money or resources of her own. 3. Linda was deeply attached to her family and community. 4. Linda never would have left her cats behind. But speaking of her cats, there is one last strange alleged occurrence that should be mentioned. When the show Unsolved Mysteries covered this case back in 1994, many years before John's murderer was captured and convicted, they reported that according to the operator of the kennel where Linda had left her 6 cats, 4 months after Linda's disappearance, a woman came in and requested to take Linda's cats. At this point, they had been there 14 weeks past the length of stay that was paid for and were going to be put down. So the operator agreed to give the woman Linda's cats. This woman was never seen again, and apparently her identity was never determined. Now, it should also be noted that no mention of this occurrence was found in any other source, so the legitimacy of this claim cannot be verified. Whether or not Linda Sohus is alive, she is still listed as an active missing person, and authorities believe foul play was involved. For anyone who might hold even the smallest piece of information, the San Marino Police Department continues to ask for help. Tips can be directed to the non-emergency line on your screen. Sometimes, it only takes one call to bring long-buried truths to light. You may have noticed that in this video, we did not name or show the killer's face. This is part of our continued effort to report on cases like these as ethically as possible. Our goal is not to censor information, but to avoid giving people like John's killer any more of a spotlight than the media has already given them. If you would like to know more about why we are doing this, watch our video about the internet sleuths who solved a murder before it happened, where we discuss the no notoriety movement in detail. Link will be in the description. If you would like to show your appreciation for the work we put into this video, then consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos, like this one about how the internet cracked a 48-year-old code and solved a case that police thought was impossible. Click the video on your screen to watch now.